Chapter 31. Jail's Empty Cane. The jail was small, merely one room with barred windows and an iron door, opening upon the street. The iron door was supplemented with a wooden one, which halted the glances of the curious. The windows were high, thus ensuring further privacy. The hard adobe floor was clean, and the bunk in which Lawler lay when the dawn came was as comfortable as might have been expected. Morton had come in just before daylight, solicitous, concerned, eager to lessen the discomforts of his prisoner. Back of the apology in his voice was a note of rage. "It goes again the grain to keep you here, Lawler," he said when he closed the door after entering. "But I'm going to bring this case to a showdown today, and don't you forget it." But the sheriff did not bring the case up that day. A little later he provided Lawler with breakfast, and toward noon he opened the door to ask Lawler how he was getting along. On the occasion of this visit he told Lawler he was trying to locate Warden, but so far hadn't been successful. "And I ain't found that Warden woman either," he declared. "I'm sending a man out to the Two Diamond for both of them, and if they ain't in town to appear again you by night, I'm going to turn you loose, and be damned to them." It seemed to Lawler that only an hour or so had elapsed when the key grated in the lock of the door and Morton stuck his head in. His face lacked expression. "Simone to see you, Lawler," he grunted gruffly. "Wants to talk to you alone. I'll be right outside so's you can call me when you've got enough of it." He pushed the door open, and Della Wharton stepped in. Morton closed the door, and Della stood watching Lawler steadily. Lawler had been standing near one of the rear windows, and when he recognized his visitor he came forward and stood within 3 or 4 paces of her. "Well, Miss Wharton," he said quietly. "I heard you were here, Lawler," she said evenly, her voice expressionless. "In fact, I saw the sheriff bring you in last night. You expected me, I presume." The sarcasm in his voice brought a faint glow to her cheeks, but her gaze was level and steady, containing much inquiry. "Yes," she said slowly, "I expected you to be brought here. You know, of course, about the charge I brought against you." "Why did you do it, Miss Wharton?" She laughed mirthlessly. "Why, I don't know, Lawler. I expect I did it because I felt I ought to tell the truth." Lawler's grim smile did not seem to affect her. She met it steadily. "You say in your charge that I deliberately planned to kill Link and Givens. You said I laid in wait for them at the door. Is that the way you saw it?" "Yes." "And you are willing to swear to that?" His smile was incredulous. She nodded affirmatively. He bowed stiffly to her. "In that case, Miss Wharton, there seems to be nothing more for us to talk about." He walked to the front window and stood on his toes, intending to call to Morton to open the door for Miss Wharton, when she moved close to him and seized his left arm, drawing him suddenly toward her while he was off balance, so that when he turned he was facing her, standing close to her. The color that had surged into her face soon after her entrance had gone. Her cheeks were white and her eyes held mute appeal that, she felt, he must respond to. She saw the cold contempt in his eyes as he looked at her, the lurking passion that lay deep in them, and the disgust that she should lie about a matter that might mean life or death to him. She must act now, and she must sacrifice Warden. Her grasp on his arm tightened. She clung to him in seeming frenzy, and she spoke brokenly, pleadingly. "Lawler, I don't believe what I said, what was written on that paper I signed. I know you acted in self-defense. You couldn't help doing as you did. Gary Warden forced me to sign that statement, Lawler. He threatened to kill me if I didn't. He found out, some way, that I had been in the cabin with you, and he made me sign. He told me that he didn't intend to charge you with the murder. He said he merely wanted to threaten you, to keep you out of politics. Please believe me, Lawler." Lawler laughed coldly, incredulously. "A minute ago you told me. I did that to frighten you," she declared. I thought that, perhaps when you saw that I would testify against you, you would." She paused and tried to get closer to him, but he held her off and watched her keenly, suspiciously. "Lawler," she urged, "don't you see, I thought you would agree to marry me if I told you that. And now, it don't make a damn bit of difference what you say," interrupted a voice from the doorway. Both Miss Wharton and Lawler wheeled quickly to see Sheriff Morton standing in the room. He was grinning hugely, though his eyes were gleaming subtly. While Lawler and Miss Wharton watched him, he slowly tore to pieces the statement the woman had signed and scattered them upon the floor. "That is all of that damned nonsense," he declared. "Lawler, I knowed there was something behind all this. That is why I let this hussy in to talk to you. I thought I'd hear something, and I did. Lawler, you're free as the air. If there is any more of this talk about charging you with killing them two guys, and you don't salivate them, that is, join the talkin', I will. After his first quick glance at Morton, Lawler looked at Della. The deep amusement Lawler felt over the knowledge that the sheriff had overheard Della, and that the woman's evidence would now be discredited, was revealed in his smile as he watched her. She saw it. She also understood that she had failed, but she veiled her chagrin and disappointment behind a scornful smile. Framed, she said. And it was crude work, too, wasn't it, Lawler? I should have been more careful. Ha, Lawler. I should have known you would do something like this, after what happened in the line cabin, and I let you trick me. She raised her head, disdaining to glance at Lawler as she walked to the door, in front of which Morton was standing. She smiled broadly at the latter. Mr. Sheriff, she said evenly, if you will stand aside, I shall be glad to leave you. Morton grinned admiringly. You've sure got a heap of nerve, ma'am, he complimented. I'll say that for you. I don't know what your game is, but you're mighty clever. Though you're wasting your time out here in the sagebrush, you ought to stay east, where there is a lot more rummies than there is out here. He opened the door and bowed her out with extravagant politeness. Then, when she had gone, he motioned Lawler toward the door. Jail's empty, Kane, but I reckon we'd better play this deal safe. Dorgan, the county prosecutor, is in his office. We'll go down to see him, and I'll have him make a record of what happened here. Then, if I happen to get bumped off this here planet, them scum can't come back at you. Cyan, this never came off. Lawler accompanied Morton to the office of the prosecutor, who took the depositions of both men, attested the document, and placed it in the office safe. So that is the kind of a dame she is, eh? Grinned the official. Well, she don't look it, but you never can tell, can you? Chapter 32. Red King runs. Sheriff Morton had left Red King at the livery stable, and after Lawler had thanked the sheriff for his part in the little drama that had just been played, he walked to the stable, saddled and bridled the big horse, mounted and rode out of town toward the Circle L. While grim tragedy had lurked over the incident that had just closed, the thing had had its humorous side. And as Lawler rode, he reflected smilingly, though feeling a pulse of shame for Della Warden, in spite of the fact that the woman had charged Gary Warden with evolving the plot. Lawler felt nothing but contempt for the man. Warden's schemes, so far, had resulted only in discomfiture for Warden himself. And because Lawler was not vindictive, he entertained no thoughts of reprisal. However, Lawler was now well equipped with evidence of Warden's misdeeds. Months before, he had sent to Metcalf, the editor of the News, in the capital, the story of the drive to Red Rock, embellished with an account of his adventure with Antrim's gang, his capture of Antrim, and the subsequent bringing of the outlaw to Willits, where he had delivered him to Warden. Metcalf had written him that the publication of the article had created a sensation in the state, and it appeared from the prominent position in which Metcalf had placed the story, on the front page, with a picture of Lawler dominating, and big, black headlines announcing, "Prominent Cattleman Worsts Trail Horde," that Metcalf had kept his promise to the effect that he intended to feature his fight against the power that was attempting to control the cattle industry. So far, though, Lawler had no evidence that the governor's power had been used against them. He was convinced that Warden, Jordan, Simmons, and the others were employing their talents against him with the secret approval of the governor. But until he secured absolute, damning evidence, he dared not openly charge it. Lawler had been waiting patiently for such evidence. He had felt all along that sooner or later his enemies would overreach themselves, leaving some weak spot through which he could attack, and he had been content to wait until that time, merely defending himself and his interests, planning no aggressive campaign. The effect of the assaults of his enemies thus far had disturbed him little. He had been able to anticipate most of their attacks, and they had resulted in little harm to himself. They had left him unperturbed, unharmed, like the attacks of an excitable poodle upon a giant, contemptuous mastiff. Deep in his heart, though, lurked a spark of passion that, day by day, had been slowly growing, warming him, making his veins swell a little when his thoughts dwelt upon Warden and the others, bringing into his heart a savage longing that he often had yielded to in the old days, before he had learned to control his passions, there were times when he was almost persuaded to break the laws for which he had fought in the old days. Moments when it seemed to him that further toleration of the attacks of his enemies would be a sign of weakness. But he had conquered those surges of passion, though the victory always left him with a smile on his face that would have a warden had he seen it. Something of that passion was in his heart now, as he rode toward the Circle L. It had become plain to him that Warden would adopt any means to destroy him, that in the man's heart was a malignant hatred that was driving him to a boldness that could mean nothing, but that in the end they must settle their differences as man to man. Lawler would not always be able to control the passion that lurked in him. He knew it. One day Warden would press him too hard, and then his thoughts had made him oblivious to his surroundings. A whinny from Red King brought him out of his ruminations, and he looked swiftly up and then directly ahead to see a horseman racing toward him, the rider crouched in the saddle, the horse running low, coming toward him at a speed that brought him out of depressions with light, flying bounds, and over the crests of small hills with a velocity that was dizzying. The running horse and the crouching rider were still a mile from Lawler, but even at that distance Lawler recognized Shorty, and he urged Red King on to meet him, suspecting that nothing but a stern emergency would make the man race his horse at that speed. Lawler glanced back as he rode. He had come several miles, and the rolling character of the plains behind him had blotted Willets out. He saw, too, that he had reached a point where three trails converged. One, which Shorty was traveling, came westward from the 2-bar, Hamlin's ranch. The other, leading almost straight southward, was the Circle L trail. The third, leading southward also, though inclining in a westward direction, ran to the Rabbit Ear, near the Dickman cabin, the ranch where Antrim and his men had established themselves. Shorty came on at cyclonic speed. When he reached a point within 100 yards of Lawler, the latter observed that Shorty's face was pale, that his jaws were set and his eyes glowing with a wild, savage light, stiffening, his lips straightening, a responsive passion assailing him. Lawler drew Red King down and waited for Shorty to reach him. He knew Shorty did not permit himself to become excited without cause, and when Shorty drew his horse to a sliding halt within half a dozen paces of Red King, Lawler saw that Shorty was in the grip of a cold, deadly passion. His eyes were glittering, his lips were stiff and white, and he was drawing great, long breaths that could be heard above the shuddering gasps of the horse he rode. The giant's fingers were working, clenching and unclenching near the butts of the 2 guns he wore, and his eyes were pools of icy rage that chilled Lawler. Twice he tried to speak as Lawler shot a short question at him, and twice he failed, making guttural sounds that betrayed the awful agitation that had seized him. At the third attempt he blurted, "Lawler, Antrim's gang has cleaned up the Circle L. Damn their sneaking dirty hides. They've run off our cattle, tucking them through Kinney's cannon. They've wiped out the Circle L outfit. Blackburn's left. Blackburn and 3 more poor fellows they plugged, and didn't finish. Blackburn made me ride for help. Damn him anyway, Lawler. I wanted to stay with the bunch." Shorty's voice broke. His lips quivered. His voice rose to a screech of impotent, awful rage brokenly. He told Lawler what had happened after the stampeding of the cattle by Antrim's men. He related, in tumbling, rapid, quavering sentences, how he had got the help Blackburn had sent him for. Caldwell's outfit, with the exception of 2 men who had been sent in different directions to other ranches, and how, later in the morning, he had returned to the shallow gully on the plains where he had left Blackburn and the others, to find most of them dead. Blackburn and 3 more had been wounded, but had survived. 15 men, Lawler, raged Shorty. 15 men wiped out by that miserable gang of coyotes. But damn them, he added with a fierce, savage joy. They didn't get away without paying toll either. There is 20 of them laying out there, Lawler. 20 of them for the coyotes to find. For Caldwell and his outfit wouldn't touch 'em when I left to come and tell you, thinkin' you was in jail. Caldwell and his boys was planting our fellows and tacking Blackburn and the 3 others to the Hamlin shack. He looked hard at Lawler, noted the paleness of the man's face, and then spoke less excitedly and with deep regret in his voice. "Lawler, I hate to tell you this. After I seen what happened to our boys, I rode this way, intendin' to tell you. The trail took me past the Hamlin shack. I wasn't intendin' to stop, but it seems like they heard me comin' and run out to see what was up. It was your mother stopped me, Lawler, smiling kind of grim, like she always smiles when things go wrong. 'Shorty,' she says, 'you go directly to town and find Kane. You know he is in jail, for I told you so last night. Tell Sheriff Morton to release him, and then tell Kane that Antrim has stolen all the Circle L cattle and has burned all the Circle L buildings. Tell him that Antrim himself burned the buildings, and that Antrim said he would wait for Kane at Antrim's shack, and that he dared Kane to come there for him. Shorty, she said, cold and calm, you tell Kane to get out of jail and go to Antrim's cabin and kill him. Lawler had sat, grim and silent, listening to Shorty. Twice had Shorty seen his eyes quicken, when Shorty had mentioned his mother, and again when he had spoken of Antrim's action in burning the Circle L buildings. Now, he leaned forward and peered intently at Shorty, and Shorty marveled how his eyes bored into his own, with a cold intensity that chilled the giant. Shorty, he said, in a low, strained voice. Mother hasn't been hurt. I forgot to tell you that, said Shorty. She said, tell Kane I am all right. Shorty opened his mouth to speak further, but closed it again when he saw Red King leap down the trails, a flaming red streak that flashed over the new grass at a speed that took him 100 yards before Shorty could get his own horse turned. The big red horse was lost in a dust cloud when Shorty urged his own animal southward, and Shorty rode as he had never ridden before, in an effort to lessen the space between himself and the flying Red King. To no avail, however. Shorty's horse was fast, but Red King seemed to have wings. So lightly did he skim over the green gulf of distance that stretched between his master and the vengeance for which Lawler's soul was now yearning. Shorty's horse was tired, and Red King was fresh, and the distance between them grew greater, always greater slowly, surely, until the red horse was lost in the tiny dust cloud that moved with unbelievable velocity far down the trail toward the rabbit ear. Chapter 33. The Fight at the Cabin. When Red King struck the river trail he was traveling, as strongly as when he began his long race, the miles that had stretched between him and the destination at which his rider aimed had been mere play for him. By the time he reached the river trail, he was warm to his work, and his giant, spurning stride carried him along in the shade of the fringing trees at a speed that made the wind whine and moan in Lawler's ears. But Lawler did not offer to check Red King's speed. The big horse was traveling at a pace that was all too slow for Lawler. Now, in the clutch of that passion which for many months had been smoldering within him, he was leaning a little forward in the saddle, riding the red horse as he had ridden few times, and then only in sport. In Lawler's eyes was still that intense light that had been in them when he had been watching Shorty as the latter had been relating what had happened during the night and the morning. And yet Lawler betrayed no sign of excitement. His face was pale, and his lips were stiff and white, but his muscles were tense, steady, and his brain clear. He knew what to expect from Antrim. If Antrim expected him to come to his cabin, Antrim would be ready for him. He might expect craft and cunning from the outlaw, an ambuscade, a trap, anything but the cold, sheer courage that would be required for him to face an enemy upon equal terms. And so, as Lawler rode, he kept an alert eye upon the coverts and the shelters, upon the huge rocks that littered the sides of the trail, upon the big trees that Red King flashed past. Nothing happened, and Red King thundered down the trail where it doubled half a mile from the Dickman cabin, and swept out upon the level that surrounded the place, his speed unslackened, his rider still urging him. Lawler had forgotten Shorty. Half a mile behind him, the giant's horse labored, making better time on the level river trail than he had made over the plains. But Lawler did not even think of Shorty. His brain was upon the work that was before him. His thoughts were definitely centered upon Antrim, and the Circle L men that Antrim and his men had killed. It was concentration of a sinister character that had seized Lawler, and in it was a single purpose, a single determination: to kill Antrim. He saw the cabin as he crossed the level, a patch of bare, sandy earth surrounding it, and the other buildings with no sign of life near them. His gaze swept the corral, and he saw no horse in it. As he guided Red King toward the cabin, he peered vainly for sight of Antrim's horse. Not a living thing was in sight. The buildings were silent, seemingly deserted, and the atmosphere of the place seemed to be pregnant with a lurking threat, a hint of hidden danger. He grinned as he plunged Red King to the door of the cabin, a grin which meant that he expected Antrim would be waiting for him, but which expressed his contempt of ambuscades and traps. As he slipped from Red King, he drew his pistol and lunged forward, bringing up against the cabin door and sending it crashing inward, against the wall. He halted just inside the door, his pistol rigid in his right hand, which was pressed tightly to his side, for directly in front of him, standing, his arms folded over his chest, was Antrim, a huge, venomous grin on his face. "Well, you got here, Lawler," he said huskily. "You come a-runnin', didn't you? Well, I had your cattle run off, and I burned your buildings. What are you aiming to do about it?" Lawler did not move. He might have killed Antrim, for the man's weapon was in the holster at his hip. Lawler could see the stock sticking above the leather. He had expected Antrim would be in the cabin when he opened the door. He anticipated that the outlaw would shoot on sight, and he had been prepared to do the same. But there was something in the outlaw's manner, in the cold, measured tone of his voice, in his nonchalant disregard of the pistol in Lawler's hand, that brought a swift suspicion into Lawler's mind. It was a presentiment that the outlaw was not alone in the cabin, that he had carefully laid his plans, and that they did not include a gunfight in which he would have to face Lawler upon equal terms. Lawler did not look around. He kept his gaze unwaveringly upon the outlaw, knowing that if other men were in the cabin with him, they were waiting for Antrim to give the word to shoot him. Otherwise, they would have shot him down when he had entered. "Not sighin' anything, eh?" jeered Antrim. "Well, come a-shootin'. You bust in here seein' red, with a gun in your hand, and then stand there like you was wonderin' if you was welcome." He peered close at Lawler, his eyes narrowing with suspicion, and then, finally, with savage amusement, "I reckon I catch on," he sneered. "You know there is someone here with me, and that they've got you covered. I know you, and I knowed you'd come rooshin' here, just like you did, killin' mad. Bah! Did you think I'd give you a chance, you short-horned maverick? There is Selden behind that curtain, there, back of the cupboard, and Krell watching you from the door of that room, on the side. They've got you between them, and if you bat an eye winker, they'll down you. I'm going to gas to you. I'm going to tell you what I think of you for roping me and dragging me back to Willets to show to the damned yaps on the station platform. And after that, I'm going to hog-tie you, Anne." "Ah!" Antrim's exclamation was a mere gasp. It escaped his lips as Lawler jumped backward, landing outside the door, overbalanced, trying to stand upright while he snapped a shot at Antrim. Antrim, however, had reached for his gun. It came out before Lawler could steady himself, and Lawler saw it. Lawler saw the weapon belch smoke and fire as it cleared Antrim's hip. He felt a shock as the bullet struck him, felt still another sear his flesh near the arm as he let his own pistol off. He saw the outlaw plunge forward and fall prone, his arms outstretched. He was motionless, inert. From inside the cabin came the sounds of steps, Antrim's confederates, Lawler supposed. He heard them approach the door, and he leaped, swaying a little, toward the corner of the cabin nearest him. He had reached it, had just dodged behind it, when Selden and Krell rushed out. At the same instant, Shorty thundered up, slipped out of the saddle, and ran toward Lawler, drawing his guns. Shorty had approached the cabin from the rear, having cut across the space behind the bunkhouses when he heard the shooting. He could not be seen by Selden and Krell as they plunged out of the door, but he had seen Lawler when the latter dodged behind the corner of the cabin, and as he ran toward Lawler, he drew his guns. As yet, Shorty had seen no one but Lawler. He supposed Antrim and Lawler had exchanged shots, and he knew Lawler had been hit. His swaying as he came around the corner of the cabin proved it. Knowing something of the terrible rage that had seized the man, he suspected Lawler had burst into the cabin, recklessly exposing himself to Antrim's fire. And as Shorty ran toward the spot where Lawler was standing, he expected to see Antrim follow, to complete his work. Within a dozen feet of Lawler, he halted facing the corner. He had not long to wait, for Selden and Krell, guns in hand, appeared almost instantly, their faces hideous with passion. As they rushed around the corner, they saw Shorty. They saw Shorty first because Shorty dominated the scene. A gun in each hand, he made a terrible figure. His eyes were blazing with the cold rage that had seized him at sight of Lawler wounded, for Lawler was now leaning against the wall of the cabin, and his gun had dropped from his hand. The unexpected appearance of Shorty startled Krell and Selden. Surprise showed in their faces as they paused for an infinitesimal space and looked at him. And then their guns roared. Shorty, however, had anticipated them. His guns went off simultaneously, slightly in advance of theirs, belching fire and smoke in a continuous stream. Shorty did not seem to be hit by the bullets from the guns of the outlaws. He seemed to pay no attention to them whatever, but the outlaws ceased shooting. Krell staggered, His guns dropped from his hands, and he stood, for an instant, looking foolishly at Shorty, his face becoming ashen. Then, without uttering a word, he lunged gently forward, his legs doubling at the knees, and sank into the dust in a huddled heap. Selden had been hit hard, too. The shock of Shorty's first bullet striking him had turned him partially around, so that his left side was toward Shorty. He had lurched forward a little, and was turning, trying to use the gun in his left hand, when another bullet struck him. He grunted, stood slowly erect, and then fell backward stiffly. Shorty ran to him, and to Krell, scanning their faces with savage intentness. When he saw that neither of them would bother him again, he leaped around the corner of the cabin and cautiously peered into the doorway. He saw Antrim stretched out on the floor of the cabin, face down and motionless. He stepped into the cabin, turned the outlaw over, grinned saturninely, and then went out to where Lawler stood. His eyes were aglow with concern. When he reached the corner, he saw Lawler bending over, picking up the pistol that had dropped from his hand a few seconds before. Lawler's face was pale, but he grinned broadly at Shorty as the latter came up to him. "I saw what was happening, but I couldn't throw in with you. I reckon Antrim hit me mighty hard in my right shoulder. I was trying to change my gun to the other hand when I dropped it. I didn't seem to be able to get it again. Just then." He grinned. "Lucky you came, Shorty," he added jocosely. Shorty's lips grim. "I reckon it is lucky I'm here right now," he said shortly. "You're hit bad, Lawler." He led Lawler into the cabin, where he tore away the latter's shirt and exposed the wound, high up on the shoulder. After a swift examination, Shorty exclaimed with relief, "It ain't so bad after all. She bored through that big muscle. Must have struck like a battering ram. No wonder you was weak and dizzy for a minute or so. There is a hole big enough to stick your hand through, but she ain't dangerous, boss." Shorty had not been touched by the bullets the outlaws had sent at him. He was energy personified. He got water, bathed the wound in Lawler's shoulder, bandaged it, and at last grinned widely as Lawler got up, saying he felt better. A little later they went out and mounted their horses. Lawler was pale, though he sat steadily in the saddle, and Shorty, big, exuding elation, grinned broadly as he glanced at the cabin as they rode away from it. They rode up the river trail, Shorty expressing his elation by emitting low chuckles of grim mirth, Lawler silent, riding steadily, his gaze straight ahead. It took them long to reach the point on the plains where the trails diverged, and then Lawler spoke. "Shorty, you go back to Hamlin's and tell Mother I killed Antrim. You needn't mention this scratch I've got." "Where you goin'?" demanded Shorty. "Shorty," said Lawler evenly, "you do as I say." "I'll be damned if I do," declared Shorty, his face flushing. "That is the kind of palaver Blackburn handed me when he sent me after Caldwell's outfit. M'kin me miss the big scrap. I ain't missin' nothin' else. If this thing is to be a clean-up, I'm going to be right close when the cleanin' is being done. I'm stayin' right here, as long as you stay. And when you get going, little Shorty will be taggin' along. A chin to salivate some more of the scum that has been making things howl in these parts. Get going where you're going." Lawler. Shorty had not told Lawler all he knew of the wound in Lawler's shoulder. He knew that Lawler had lost much blood, and that he was losing more constantly, and that nothing but the man's implacable courage was keeping him up, and he did not intend to desert him. Lawler laughed, but he said nothing as he urged Red King over the Willets trail, riding at a fair pace, not so steady in the saddle as he had been. His face was chalk white, but there was a set to his lips and a glow in his eyes that told Shorty there was no use in arguing. Shorty permitted Lawler to hold the lead he had taken when they reached the Willets trail. But Shorty kept a vigilant eye upon the big horse and his rider as they went over the plains toward town. Twice Shorty saw Lawler reel in the saddle, and both times Shorty urged his horse forward to be close to him when he fell. But each time Lawler stiffened and rode onward, silent, grimly determined, with Shorty riding behind him, watching him with awed admiration. Lawler had not mentioned the purpose of his ride to town, and Shorty was lost in a maze of futile conjecture. Shorty knew, however, that a man in Lawler's condition would not ride to town to gratify a whim, and the longer he watched Lawler, the deeper became his conviction that another tragedy was imminent, for there was something in Lawler's manner, in the steady, unflagging way he rode, in the set of his head and the cold gleam of his eyes, that suggested more of the kind of violence in which both had participated at the Dickman cabin. The sun was low when Lawler and Shorty rode into town. Lawler riding ahead as he had ridden all along, Shorty a few yards behind him, keenly watching him. There were many men on the street, for word had been brought in regarding the big fight between the Circle outfit and the rustlers, and a doctor had gone, summoned to the Hamlin cabin by a wild rider on a jaded horse. And Willet's citizens were eagerly curious, and when they saw Lawler coming, swaying in the saddle as he rode, they began to run toward him. However, they were brought to a halt by Shorty, who waved a hand savagely at them, his face expressing a cold intolerance that warned them away. And so they retreated to the sidewalk wonderingly to watch Lawler and Shorty as they rode down the street, Lawler looking neither to the right nor left, but keeping his gaze straight ahead as though in that direction lay what he had come to seek. Shorty's eyes gleamed with understanding when he saw Lawler halt Red King in front of the building in which was Warden's office. He was out of the saddle before Lawler clambered slowly out of his, and he stood near as Lawler walked to the door of the building and began to mount the stairs, going up slowly, swaying from side to side, and placing his hands against the wall on either side of him for support. And when Lawler finally reached the top of the stairs and threw open the door of Warden's office, Shorty was so close to him that he might have touched his shoulder. Warden was sitting at his desk when Lawler opened the door, and he continued to sit there, staring hard at Lawler as the latter swayed across the room to bring up with a lurch against Warden's desk, his hands grasping its edge. "Warden," said Lawler, and Shorty marveled at the cold steadiness of his voice. "I have just killed Antrim. Antrim's men ran off 3,000 head of my cattle and killed about 20 of my men, 5 at the Circle L and the rest in a fight on the plains not far from the 2 bar. Antrim burned my buildings, $25,000 for the buildings, and $90,000 for the cattle, not to mention my men. I've got no proof that you were implicated in the deal, but I am convinced that you planned it, that you got Antrim and his gang to do the work. That evidence doesn't go in law, though, Warden, and you know it. But it is enough for the kind of law that I am representing right now. It is this." He drew his gun with his left hand, taking it from the waistband of his trousers, where he had placed it when he had picked it up at the Dickman cabin, and held it on the desktop so that its dark muzzle gaped at Warden. For an instant Warden sat, staring in dread fascination into the muzzle of the weapon, his face dead white, his eyes wide with fear, naked, cringing. Then he spoke, his voice hoarse and quavering. "This is murder, Lawler." "Murder, Warden," jeered Lawler. "One of my men was worth a dozen of you." Lawler laughed, a sound that brought an ashen pallor to Warden's face. Then he straightened and turned to face Shorty. He lurched to Shorty's side, drew out one of the latter's big guns, and tossed it upon the desk within reach of Warden's hand. "I gave Antrim the first shot. Warden," he said, "I gave him his chance. I didn't murder him, and I won't murder you. Take that gun and follow me to the street. There is people there. They'll see that it is a square deal. You're a sneaking polecat, Warden, but I'm going to give you—" Lawler paused. He sagged. He tried to straighten, failed, and while both men watched him, Shorty with eyes that were terrible in their ineffable sympathy and impotent wrath, Warden in a paralysis of cold terror, Lawler lurched heavily against the desk and slid gently to the floor, where he leaned, his eyes closed against the desk, motionless, unconscious. Silently, his eyes aflame with passion, Shorty leaped to the desk and snatched the gun that Lawler had placed at Warden's hand. With almost the same movement, he pulled Warden out of his chair and threw him against the rear wall of the room. He was after the man like a giant panther, catching him by the throat with his left hand as he reached him, crushing him against the wall so that the impact jarred the building, while he savagely jammed the muzzle of the pistol deep into the man's stomach, holding it there with venomous pressure, while his blazing eyes bordens with a ferocious malignance. "Damn you, Warden," he said hoarsely. "I ought to kill you." He shook Warden with his left hand, as though the man were a child in his grasp, sinking his fingers into the flesh of his neck until Warden's eyes popped out and his face grew purple. Then he released him so suddenly that Warden sank to his knees on the floor, coughing, laboring. Straining to draw his breath, he stood huge and menacing, until Warden swayed to his feet and staggered weakly to the chair in which he had been sitting when Lawler entered. And then he leaned over the desk and peered into Warden's face. "This ain't my game, Warden. If it was, I'd choke the gizzard out of you and chuck you out of a window. I reckon I've got to save you for Lawler. If he gets over this, if he don't, I'm coming for you." He holstered his gun, stooped, lifted Lawler, and gently swung him over his shoulder, and without glancing back at Warden strode to the stairs, out into the street, and made his way to the Willits Hotel, a crowd of curious citizens at his heels. Chapter 34. Good old Shorty. Della Wharton had watched from one of the windows of her room in the hotel. She had seen Lawler and Shorty ride down the street to Warden's office. She had seen Shorty come out carrying Lawler, and she heard Shorty's steps on the stairs as he brought his burden up, preceded by the proprietor. She was standing in the hall when the proprietor and Shorty reached the upper landing, and when the proprietor looked inquiringly at her, she silently motioned toward her room and stood aside as Shorty entered and placed his limp burden upon the bed. Lawler was unconscious and ghastly pale. Della instantly took charge of Lawler, which means that she set seriously to work with him, while Shorty stood by, his arms folded over his huge chest, one hand caressing his chin, grimly watching. Shorty continued to watch. For many days he stood guard over his boss, a somber, brooding figure, silent, imperturbable. When he moved, it was only to walk slowly up and down the hall, or downstairs to take his meals. At other times he would stand at the bedside looking down at Lawler's closed eyes and ashen face, or he would sit on the edge of a chair and watch him, intently, with stoic calm, his face as expressionless as a stone image. Mrs. Lawler came early the next morning, after the doctor had told Della and Shorty there was a fighting chance for Lawler and Ruth Hamlin. Shorty's eyes grew moist as he watched Mrs. Lawler and Ruth as they stood by the unconscious man, and his voice was low and gruff when, during the day, Mrs. Lawler asked him for particulars. "That is all there was to it, ma'am," he said in conclusion. "The boss oughtn't to have busted in that shack like he did knowing Antrim was there, and given the scum a chance to take the first shot at him, but he done it. And he done the same thing to Warden, offered him the first shot. Ma'am, I never heard the beat of it. I've got nerve, as the sawing is, but Lordy." And Shorty became silent again. For 3 days Lawler remained unconscious, and during that interval there were no disturbing sounds to agitate the death-like quiet of the sick room. Riders glided into town from various points of the compass and stepped softly as they moved in the street, whispering or talking in low tones. The universal topic was the fight and Lawler's condition. On the second day of Lawler's unconsciousness, a keen-eyed man stepped off the eastbound train and made his way to the hotel. "I'm Metcalf of the Sooty Newsen and the Capital," he told Keller, the proprietor, and Keller quietly ushered the newspaperman upstairs, where the latter stood for a long time until Mrs. Lawler opened the door of the sick room for him. Metcalf entered, looked down at Lawler, and then drew Shorty aside where, in a whispered conversation, he obtained the particulars of the fight and the wounding of Lawler. He took the westbound train that night. A pall seemed to have settled over Willits. The atmosphere was tense, strained. Riders from Caldwell's ranch, from Sigmund's, from Lester's, and from other ranches came in, and important-looking men from various sections of the state alighted from the trains at the station and lingered long in the dingy foyer of the hotel. One of these was recognized by Keller's McGregor, secretary of the state central committee of Lawler's party, and Keller noted that McGregor wore a worried look and that he scowled continually. Willits waited. The riders who came into town waited. It seemed to the residents of Willits that the whole state waited, with its collective gaze upon the little room in the hotel where a man lay, fighting for his life. Shorty waited, still silent, the somber brooding light in his eyes. His jaws set a little tighter, his eyes filled with a deeper glow. Shorty said no word to any man regarding the deadly intention that reigned in his heart. He merely waited, watching Lawler, grimly determined that if Lawler died he would keep his promise to come for Warden. But Shorty would not have found Warden in town. On the night of the shooting, Warden had taken the westbound train, and the next day he was closeted with the governor in Hatfield, the three of them sitting in the governor's office, where, their faces pale, though expressing no regret, they sat and talked of the fight and conjectured over its probable consequences. Singleton stayed close to the Two Diamond, and after the second day, Della Wharton rode to the ranch and sat brooding over the failure of her plans. When Lawler had been brought into the hotel, she had entertained a hope that the situation might be turned to her advantage. But there had been something in Ruth Hamlin's clear, direct eyes that had convinced her of the futility of attempting to poison her mind against Lawler by referring to her stay in the line cabin with Lawler. She saw faith in Ruth's eyes, complete, disconcerting. and it had made her feel inferior, unworthy, cheap, and inconsequential. On the fourth day, Lawler regained consciousness. The doctor had told them all that the crisis was at hand, that if the fever broke, marking the end of the delirium which had seized him, he would awaken normal mentally, though inevitably weak. But if the fever did not break, there would be no hope for him. Mrs. Lawler, Ruth, and Shorty were in the room with Lawler when he opened his eyes. For a long time the three stood, breathlessly watching as Lawler lay, staring in bewilderment at the ceiling, at the walls, and out of the windows, through which came a soft, subdued light. Presently Lawler raised his head a trifle, saw them all, and smiled. The clear light of reason was in his eyes. "Mother, Ruth, and Shorty," he said, weakly smiling. "I've known for a long time that you were here, but I couldn't let you know." "Mother and Ruth and Shorty," he repeated, and then, in a lower voice that trailed off into a murmur as he closed his eyes and appeared to be falling asleep, "Good old Shorty." Ruth and Mrs. Lawler were clasped in each other's arms, joy unutterable in their eyes. It was some time before they turned to look at Shorty. The tawny giant was standing near the foot of the bed. His lips were quivering, his eyes were wet, his whole body seemed to be racked with emotion that he could not suppress. He was making an heroic effort, though, an effort that made the cords of his neck stand out lividly, that swelled his muscles into knotty bunches. "Damn it," he growled as he turned his head away from Ruth and Mrs. Lawler, so that they might not see what was reflected there. "There ain't no sense of him getting mush-headed about it." Chapter 35. Haunting Memories. It was many days before Lawler was strong enough to ride Red King to the Circle L, and many more days join the regiments that have marched into the ages before he forgot what he saw in Blackburn's eyes, when one day, soon after his return to the Circle L, he listened to the range boss relate the story of the fight on the plains. Blackburn's cynical eyes had changed expression. They had become tragic, strained, as though the man was striving to blot out mental pictures that were detailed there. Pictures that memory persisted in drawing. He rode with Lawler to the scene of the fight and showed him where the Circle L outfit had brought the rustlers to bay. "After Shorty left," said Blackburn, "me insistin' on him goin', and him blackguardin' me for sendin' him. There was a little time when nothing happened. Then the day broke, and everything seemed to happen at once. They rushed us, Lawler. There was more of 'em than there was of us, and they circled around us, howlin' and shootin' like Indians. They got us between 'em, but we fought 'em, Lawler. We fought 'em till there wasn't a man left standing, but there was too many of 'em. We planted 20 afterward, but about that number got away. I was hit sort of hard, but I watched 'em scutterin' towards Kinney's Cayon. They'd been gone some time when Caldwell's outfit and Shorty come up. Caldwell's outfit lit out after 'em, but Caldwell's men had rode pretty hard gettin' to us, and it wasn't no go. Sigmund's men, though, and Lester's and the rest of 'em, had took a gorge trail that cuts into the big basin from the south, away the other side of Kinney's Canyon, and they run plumb into the rustlers over at the edge of the basin on Sigmund's side. And they brought back your cattle, though Slade and 20 or 30 of his men got away. Clean. I reckon you've heard about enough. And well, Lawler, that is about all exceptin' to tell you how the boys, and I don't seem to want to go over that when I'm awake. I keep seeing it enough of nights. But something of the deep emotion Blackburn felt was reflected in Lawler's eyes from the time he heard the story. During the many days he had spent in the little hotel room recovering from his wound, and in the long interval of convalescence that followed, a small army of workmen had been engaged in rebuilding the Circle L ranch house, the bunkhouses, and the other structures. On the second day following his return to consciousness, Lawler had called in a contractor and had made arrangements for reconstruction. A temporary cabin, to be used afterward by Blackburn, had been erected near the site of the bunkhouses, and into this Lawler and his mother moved while the ranch house and the other buildings were being rebuilt. Blackburn was slowly engaging men to fill the depleted complement, and the work went on some way, though in it was none of that spirit which had marked the activities of the Circle L men in the old days. In fact, the atmosphere that surrounded the Circle L seemed to be filled with a strange depression. There had come a cold grimness into Blackburn's face. A sullenness had appeared in the eyes of the three men who had survived the fight on the plains. They were moody, irritable, impatient. One of them, a slender, lithe man named Sloan, voiced to Blackburn one day a prediction. "Antrim's dead, all O-key," he said. But Slade, who was always a damn sight worse than Antrim, is still a kickin'. And Slade ain't the man to let things go halfway. Them boys from the other outfits bested him. All right, but Slade will be back, you'll see. And when he comes, we'll be squaring things with him. And don't you forget it. It was after Lawler had been occupying the cabin for a month that Metcalf made his second visit. He rode down the slope of the valley on a horse he had hired at Willits, and came upon Lawler, who was standing at the corral gates, looking across the enclosure at the workmen who were bustling about the ranch house. Metcalf regarded Lawler critically before he dismounted, and then he came forward, shook Lawler's hand, and again looked him over. A little thin and peaked, but otherwise all right, eh? He smiled. It is hard to kill you, denizens of the sagebrush. He followed Lawler into the shade of the cabin, remarked to Mrs. Lawler that her son would need someone to guard him if he persisted in meeting outlaws of the Antrim type single-handed, and then turned to Lawler, after Mrs. Lawler had gone inside, and said lowly, "Lord, man, you've got this state raving over you. Your fight against the ring is talked about in every corner of the country, and that scrap with Antrim, Selden, and Krell in the old Dickman cabin will go down in history. It will be a classic. What made you rush in on Antrim that way, giving him the first shot?" Lawler smiled faintly. "Shucks, Metcalf, there was nothing to that. Shorty told me what had happened, and as I recollect now, I was pretty much excited." "Excited, eh?" said Metcalf incredulously. "I don't believe it. What about your going into Warden's office, offering to give him the first shot? Were you excited then?" Lawler reddened, and Metcalf laughed triumphantly. "Lawler," he said, "you're too damned modest, but modesty becomes you. I believe you know it. Anyway, this state is raving over you. You're going to be the next governor. You've got to run. This state needs a man like you. It needs you. You know it. Everybody knows it. And everybody wants you. That is, everybody except Houghton, Hatfield, Warden, and that bunch including the railroad company. Why, look here, Lawler," he went on. When Lawler did not answer, "The fight you made last fall against the railroad company was made, with variations, by all the courageous cattlemen in the state. If a strong man isn't elected this fall, the same fight will have to be made again. Houghton is so rotten that people are beginning to hold their noses. The people of this state trust you, Lawler. They swear by you. You've got to run. There is no way out of it." He looked keenly at Lawler. "Man, do you know what McGregor told me the day before he left the capital to come down here and look you over, to see how badly you were hurt? He said, 'Metcalf, if Lawler dies, we lose the governorship next fall. He is the only man who can beat Houghton.'" "Metcalf," smiled Lawler, "I'll tell you a secret. Your argument has had no effect upon me. I decided this thing as far back as the day following the last election. I am going to run." "Then we've got Houghton licked," declared Metcalf. Enthusiastically, Metcalf stayed at the Circle L throughout the day, and in the evening Lawler rode with him to Willits, where he saw him aboard the westbound train. "I'm telling you something, Lawler," grinned the newspaperman as he gripped Lawler's hand just before the train started. "McGregor came to me yesterday. He told me he intended to come to see you, but he was afraid you'd refuse to run. He asked me if I had any influence with you, and I told him you'd do anything I suggested. Now, don't get excited, Lawler." He laughed as Lawler looked sharply at him. "I've proved it, haven't I? You've agreed to run, Lord Man. I'd hate to be an evildoer and have you look at me like that." He laughed again, exultantly. "What was it you said to Warden one day, when Warden refused to keep that agreement you made with Leffingwell?" "Oh, don't look at me that way. That conversation has been printed all over the state. I saw to that. How did I hear of it? Somebody must have talked, Lawler. It wasn't you. You remember what you told Warden. It was this. I'm telling you this, though. A man's word in this country has got to be backed by his performances, and he has got to have memory enough to know when he gives his word. You've given yours, Lawler, and you can't back out. McGregor will be waiting for me in the capital. And when I tell him that I have persuaded you to run, he'll fall on my neck and weep tears of joy. Then he'll hire a special train and run down here to fall on your neck." McGregor came the next day, and he took Lawler back to the capital with him. Lawler stayed in the capital for a week, and when he returned, he went directly to the Circle L. No word came from him. To Willits. During the summer, he did not appear in town, though Willits heard that the new Circle ranch house had at last been completed and that Lawler was living in it. Also, the Circle L outfit had been recruited to full strength. Blackburn was occupying the new cabin when Corwin, who was chairman of the county committee, sent out calls for the county primary election, which convention was also to choose delegates to the state convention, to be held later. Lawler did not appear. He sent a note to Corwin, asking to be excused. "I reckon he ain't entirely over that wound," Corwin told an intimate friend. "We'll have to get along without him this time." But there was a light in Corwin's eyes which told that he was not unaware of the significance of Lawler's trip to the capital with McGregor. There came a day when Corwin and his brother, delegates, got on a train at Willits and were taken to the capital. And there came another day when they returned. They brought a brass band with them, and Willits closed its doors and went out into the street, and crowded the station platform where the band was playing and where the returned delegates, frenzied with joy, were shrieking above the din, "Hurrah for Cain Lawler! Lawler, our next governor! Hip, hip, hooray, we swamped him!" howled a crimson-faced enthusiast. There was nothing to it. Unanimous after the first vote, hooray, in his office. Gary Warden heard the shouting, saw the crowd, and listened to the cheers. He stood at one of the windows, balefully watching, sneering at the delegates who had returned, flushed with victory. Singleton, scowling, stood beside Warden. They saw half a dozen men draw apart from the others. Later the men, delegates, from the gay badges appended to them, rode out of town southward. "Reception committee," sneered Warden. "They're going to escort Lawler to town. Let's go to the Two Diamond. I'll be damned if I want to be in town to watch Lawler grin when he sees that crowd. There is a dozen big guns in that bunch who have come down from the capital to watch the fun. Well, it is no fun for me. However, it was fun for the delighted citizens of Willits, who, some hours later, saw the reception committee returning with Lawler. They escorted him to a platform which had been erected in the middle of the street in the absence of the reception committee, where, after the crowd had cheered him many times, Lawler made his first speech as the candidate of his party. Energetic citizens had gaily decorated the street with flags and bunting, taking Corwin's entire stock, and the varicolored decorations swathed the town from end to end. Warden and Singleton had scurried out of town long before the coming of Lawler, but Jimmy Singleton, with a number of other children who had mercifully been dismissed by the school teacher, were close to the platform during the celebration. "He is going to be governor, Jimmy," whispered one of Jimmy's companions, awe in his voice as he indicated Lawler, who was just concluding his speech. "I've knowed him a long time," went on Jimmy's friend proudly. "Huh," said Jimmy. "I've knowed him longer than you, and besides, he walloped me, and he walloped my paw too." Shorty had ridden to town with Lawler, and Shorty rode home with the candidate for governor. After the citizens of Willits had shouted themselves hoarse and the prominent men who had come down from the capital had taken the evening train home, and Shorty said nothing when Lawler veered from the Circle L trail and headed eastward toward Hamlin's cabin. And he waited with much patience outside the cabin while Lawler went in, to stay an unconscionably long time. Ruth was alone, and her eyes were glowing with happiness when she saw Lawler. "Oh, I know," she said when Lawler essayed to break the news to her. "On his way to town, Blackburn rode over and told me. All of your men were in town, didn't you know that?" "Ruth," said Lawler, "I will be elected. Won't you come to the capital with me to be the first lady of the state?" She looked straight at him, her face paling. "Wait, Cain," she said gently. I can't just now. Oh, Cain, don't you see that the higher you go, the harder it is for me? I can't have people say what they might say, what your enemies would be sure to say. Father is all right now, but I can't depend upon him. We will wait, Cain, until we are sure." Shorty rode with Lawler after they left the Hamlin cabin, and the gravity of Lawler's expression was noted by the giant, and duly commented upon the following morning in Blackburn's presence. "The boss's trail is sure hard to anticipate," said Shorty. "There is the state going loco over him, nominating him for governor, and folks in Willits McKeaned more fuss over him than they did over the president. The time he stopped for 2 minutes in town. Well, you'd think a man would be sort of fussed up himself over that kind of a deal. But what does the boss do? He rides home with me, Cyan, nothing pretty regular, with a face on him as long as the moral law. And then some. I ain't got no rope on him. and that is a fact, but he is all wool and a yard wide, ain't he? Blackburn. Chapter 36. A man meditates vengeance. It had always been lonely at the Hamlin cabin, and it grew more lonely after Kane Lawler left the Circle L. For the barrier between Ruth and the happiness she had a right to expect seemed to grow higher and more impassable daily. After receiving official notification of his nomination, Lawler had gone away on a speaking tour of the state, and Ruth had seen little of him. He came home once for a few days just before the election and had renewed his pleas to Ruth. But the girl, rigidly adhering to her determination not to permit the shadow of her father's reputation to embarrass him, had firmly refused to consent. And after the election, when he had gone to the capital to take the office to which he had been chosen by a record vote, she watched him ride away with a consciousness that the world had grown to gigantic proportions, and that Lawler was going to its extreme farther limits, leaving behind him a gulf of space, endless and desolate. Dorgan, the country prosecutor, had been defeated for re-election by a man named Carney, who was known to be friendly to Singleton. Morton had also been defeated by Slim McCrae, who hailed from a little town called Keagles, southeast from Willits. It was rumored, after the election, that Slim McCrae had been friendly to Antrim, though no one advanced any evidence in support of the rumor. McCrae, because Willits was the county seat, came to the office that had formerly been Morton's immediately following his election. He was slender, tall, and unprepossessing, and instantly created a bad impression. This news came to Ruth through her father, for she had not visited town since she had gone there to help Mrs. Lawler care for her son. She felt that she did not dare to leave the cabin, for one night, after her father had acted strangely, he got up suddenly and went out of the door. And after a while, growing suspicious, she blew out the light and stepped softly outside to see him at a little distance from the house talking with Singleton. That incident had occurred shortly after Lawler had departed for the capital to assume his duties as governor. She suspected her father had talked with Singleton since, though she had never seen them together from that time until now. Lawler had been gone a month. She had heard through various mediums, mostly from cowboys from nearby ranches who occasionally passed the cabin, that Lawler was making good, in the vernacular of the cowpuncher, and McKin them all set up and take notice. Those terms, of course, would seem to indicate that Lawler was a good governor and that he was attracting attention by the quality of his administration. But it seemed that more than a month had passed since Lawler had gone to the capital. The days dragged and the weeks seemed to be eons long, and yet the dull monotony of the girl's life was relieved by trips she made to the Circle L to visit Lawler's mother, and by the presence of Mary Lawler, who had come home for her vacation during the summer and during Lawler's absence on his speaking tour. Ruth had heard with satisfaction that the Circle L trail herd, attended by Blackburn, Shorty, and other Circle L men, had not been molested on the trip to Red Rock. Caldwell and the others had driven their cattle to Red Rock also, not one of them visiting Warden to arrange for cars. Lawler's influence and the spirit he had revealed in undertaking the long drive the previous season had had its effect upon the other owners. It seemed to Ruth that the fight between the Circle L men and the rustlers had made the latter cautious, and that even Warden had decided that discretion was necessary. At any rate, the surface of life in Willits and the surrounding country had become smooth, no matter what forces were at work in the depths. It appeared that the men who had fought Lawler in the past were now careful to do nothing that would bring upon them a demonstration of his new power. Gary Warden, however, was not fearful of Lawler's official power. In fact, he was openly contemptuous when Lawler's name was mentioned in his presence. Face to face with Lawler, he was afflicted with an emotion that was akin to fear, though with it was mingled the passionate hatred he had always felt for the man. While Lawler had been at the Circle L, he had fought him secretly, with motives that arose from a determination to control the cattle industry. Warden had had behind him the secret power of the state government and the clandestine cooperation of the railroad company. His fight against Lawler had been in the nature of business, in which the advantage had been all on his side. Now, however, intense personal feeling dominated Warden. Lawler had beaten him so far, and the knowledge intensified his rage against his conqueror. The railroad company's corral had yawned emptily during the entire fall season. Not a hoof had been shipped through Willits. All the cattlemen of the district had driven their stock to Red Rock, and Warden no longer smiled at the empty corral. Looking out of one of his office windows this morning, Warden scowled. He remembered a day, a year or so ago, when he had stood in one of the windows of his office watching Della Warden wave a handkerchief at Lawler. She had been riding out of town in a buckboard, with Aunt Hannah beside her, and Lawler had just come from the railroad station. That incident had spread the poison of jealousy in Warden's veins. The recollection of it had caused him to doubt Della's story of what had happened at the line cabin during the blizzard of the preceding winter. It had filled him with the maddening conviction that Lawler had deliberately tried to alienate Della's affections. That Lawler, knowing Della to be vain and frivolous, had intentionally planned the girl's visit to the line cabin. He did not blame Della for what had happened. Upon Lawler was the blame for the affair. Lawler had planned it all, merely to be revenged upon him for his refusal to keep the agreement that had been made with Leffingwell. Warden sneered as his thoughts went to that day in Jordan's office when Lawler, a deadly threat in his eyes, had leaned close to him to warn him. Warden remembered the words. They had flamed in his consciousness since. "But get this straight," Lawler had said. "You've got to fight me, understand? You'll drag no woman into it. You went to Hamlin's ranch the other day. God's grace and a woman's mercy permitted you to get away alive. Just so sure as you molest a woman in the section, just so sure will I kill you, no matter who your friends are." Apparently, in Lawler's code of morals, it was one thing to force one's attentions upon a pretty woman, and another thing to steal the affections of a woman promised to another man. But Warden's passion permitted him to make no distinction, and his rage was based upon the premise that Lawler was guilty. Warden's thoughts grew abysmal as he stood at the window, and considerations of business became unimportant in his mind as the satanic impulse seized him. He stood for a long time at the window, and when he finally seized hat and coat and went down into the street, he was muttering, savagely, "God's grace and a woman's mercy. Bah, damn you, Lawler. I'll make you squirm."